Hey everybody, today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 favorite films of 2023. I struggled to put this list together this year just because I didn't love a lot of movies this year. I should say I struggled with a lot of movies this year, so that made it kind of difficult to narrow it down. But I will say, anytime I make these lists, just take them with a grain of salt because they're always shifting around in my mind. What it is today, it could be different tomorrow. And I don't get to see every single movie of the year. A lot of times it starts to trickle into other years. As an example, when I look at my top 10 of last year, it's like, no, that would be different today. Actually, my number one film of 2022, I hadn't even seen in 2022, so it's not even on my list. And if you've watched me regularly, you know the kinds of movies that I tend to like. I tend to go for the movies that, yeah, they are more polarizing. They might split people. Also, this list is going to be in no particular order, but I will say the first one that happens to be on the list is a perfect segue because I think it fits under that category of very polarizing, very frustrating type of movie. And yet I couldn't get it out of my mind, so it's absolutely on the list. But the first one is Beau is Afraid, directed by Ari Aster. And yeah, I remember sitting in the theater watching this 3-hour odyssey for our Joaquin Phoenix character and just struggling. I felt like I was, treading through mud. It reminded me a lot of what Babylon was for 2022. Damien Chazelle's Babylon, just in the sense that, yeah, it's a mess of a movie. And yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. As I was watching the movie in the theater, I was like, this is going to be on my top of the year, no question. It's trying a lot of new things that I have not seen before. That excited me. It really challenged me, even though no, it did not materialize in the ways that I wanted, which is, yeah, the irony. And I will say, all of these movies I have done reviews for, so you're going to get a lot more in-depth stuff if you actually just watch the review for it. But, this is just kind of bulleted. But I will say, my problems with the movie were that it was very long-winded. It felt like it was doing a lot of abstract, visual, psychedelic puffery, padding. And it's just that A24 thing I get tired of, where it's like, it's all aesthetic driven. It's all style to create the meaning. And that just creates a little bit of thinness to the experience, and yet the metaphors themselves are heavy and overworked. So there's just a lack of balance for me. And the movie is broken up into 3 or 4 chunks, I would say. Second half really didn't work for me, but the first half, I was riveted by it, especially that first section, the section where Joaquin Phoenix is in the apartment. It is an absolute nightmare. It has you by the jugular the entire time. It is so anxiety-inducing. I just loved it. Honestly, I wish they had just taken that section and made it into a short film. And I wish they had taken maybe the Nathan Lane section, that whole part. That could have been a short film. It is so eerie, but yet very different from the first section of the film at the same time. I think that the writing in this is incredibly underrated. I think it has some of the best writing, again, of Ari Aster's career, the humor in it, this weird ability to make a movie that's not a horror film, and yet I think it's scarier than most horror films. It's such an ambitious work. It just didn't have enough gas in the tank for me for this big, beautiful machine to be able to show off what it can really do. And while it does hurt me, I can see myself returning to this film over time constantly and still being fascinated by it. My next film is May December, and this is directed by Todd Haynes. I found this film absolutely delicious, and I found it to be dry. It has some of the best, yeah, this is another one. This has some of the best humor of the year for me in movies. And I also think it's one of the funniest films Todd Haynes has ever made, and he's a director that I greatly admire. And I love that we're taking this persona idea, the Ingmar Bergman original idea of persona, which we've seen interpreted by all kinds of different auteurs, particularly David Lynch or Robert Altman, but we're putting a little bit of a twist on it, a meta twist. I love the idea of this actress, this famous actress that is coming in to study the real life person that she's going to play for a movie. It creates so many layers, obviously, from the way performers are perceiving reality, but also the way that maybe normal people, average people are perceiving the performers and how they're perceiving cinema. The romanticism of the performer bringing out maybe a certain character's unlikely self-actualization. I thought that was brilliant, a really subversive twist that I think separates this film from maybe the other interpretations that I mentioned before. Because it's like, this movie is about women, and very, very dominant women. And yet ultimately we realize that we're siding with the male character of the film, Joe. He is the one who is the heart and soul of the entire picture. It's a dark film, but it is so full of detail. I've seen it a couple of times now, and the richness of the character building, I don't know, it just really warms my heart because I don't see movies that are this fantastic. It's very Douglas Sirk, and we see a lot of that, but this also, had something refreshing about it at the same time. And yeah, it was a meta experiment that actually paid off, and it often doesn't for me these days. I think part of it is because you know, like with the Julianne Moore character, I think in another movie, she might be the main character and we'd have all of this, you know, sympathy for her in a specific way. Whereas here, she's kind of kept at a distance from us. That creates the crux of the tension, but it allows a lot of those meta aspects to bloom. And it also allows Joe's character to start to flourish in the way that we need. Yeah, the performances are great. The directing is great. Everything from top to bottom is just fabulous. I highly, highly, highly recommend this. Up next is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. And this is directed by a lot of people, so I'm not even going to list them because I just don't feel like it. But this movie astounded me. It absolutely astounded me. I was just knocked over practically while I was sitting in the theater. It's easily one of the most dazzling films of the year, but just one of the most inspired, energetic, creative ones that just had an energy about it that was infectious. I have never seen animation like this on this level, and there's just so much going on in the film that you're worried it's going to completely combust. It flirts so often with going off the rails, and yet it never does. It's right on the edge. There is a restless sort of ADD type of energy to it, and yet it knows when to slow down and have the slower moments, give us as audience members, you know, the time to breathe before it takes us back into, again, the joy, the exuberance. This is a heroic dose of something, and it is an overload of all these creative forces joining together. I think that the villain is really, really underrated in this movie. I just love his arc. It's unexpected, and it really built off the first film, which I struggled with the villain in that. And I struggled with the midsection of the film, the Test Allies and Enemies period of the first one, and I felt like they improved on all of that for the second film. My only problem with the film is in the third act. It starts to fizzle a little bit, especially at the end. It just kind of drops off, very much like a comic book. It's very to be continued. Some people might really like that. For me, I kind of wanted something to be a little bit more of a conclusion that can lead us into something else, like Lord of the Rings. I think they did it really well, as an example. Next on my list, I'm going with Talk to Me. This was directed by Danny and Michael Philippbaum. This was, I'd say, the big surprise horror film of the year for me, just like Barbarian was last year. I do consider Barbarian maybe more stylistically interesting, maybe more cinematic in certain ways, and yet I loved the intimacy of this one. I love the emphasis on the characters and the emotion in Talk to Me. It's a really gut-wrenching film, one that affected me very much after I saw it, maybe more than almost any of the year, and I've seen it a few times since, and it still has a very strong effect on me. It is a film that is exploring Gen Z and like the shock culture of drugs and social media and the peer pressure and needing to be seen, all of these things, but what I love about the film is that it's really taking you into the depths of the consequences for it. And it really does not shy away from it. And that's what leads us into a conclusion that I think is one of the most tragic and haunting conclusions, yes, of the entire year. I was really surprised by the sincerity with which they're exploring kind of the drug metaphors and the emotions that are associated with it for these young kids. There were times that I did feel like I wish the images and maybe some of the metaphors could have been more scary, more creative, so it could take us into maybe more complex aspects of that experience. But overall, I think this plot is very sound, and I think the majority of it follows through. I did not know the Philippou brothers at all before this, and now obviously I've learned a lot about them. They're very, very interesting, and I did listen to them on Joe Rogan, and just like their energy, I think there was a comment that said they're basically like the live versions of Terrence and Phillip. That was fantastic. They are just so chaotic as individuals. It's like, how could people like that make a movie like this? And yet, you know, they started talking about their family history and their mom's history with depression. So all of that, I was like, there's the curiosity. So I started to see threads of them kind of exploring their destructive nature in ways that I think could be really interesting if they continued to make, you know, films like this. But yeah, I'm just really impressed with the maturity here and the cohesion. Next on my list is Poor Things, and this is directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. What an extraordinary film this is, just in terms of the world building, visually. It was like watching a Luis Buñuel film, but like through the filter of like a snow globe. And yet it's rooted in so many different things, from, you know, satire to comedy to absurdism to surrealism to like musicals. And yet it all works and it makes sense in a cohesive way. This is kind of what I wish that Emerald Fennell's Saltburn had been. This is an intelligent pastiche that for me is very rich and it's very thought through, whereas Saltburn was like, while I admire the energy of it, it's a little patchy. It feels like a scrapbook. This is an artistic exploration of the feminist experience, and often I hate movies like that, these days at least, because they feel incredibly reductive. Not only are they reducing women, but they're heavily reducing men. For me, this one had some dimension to it. Some people found it to be very one note, that Bella Baxter is exploring a lot of her world through her maturity through sex, and I thought to myself, no, that's very accurate, actually. It's very accurate for certain women who look a certain way, like Bella Baxter, that you know, they're going to be given a certain type of attention, and it's very hard to escape that cycle, and it can become quite vicious. And yet, I did wish that they could have explored the feminist motivation more in the narrative here. What I'm dying for is for one of these feminist heroes of one of these movies to actually be challenged, where a lot of her morals are going to be called into question. I wanted Bella to find somebody that met her match, you know, like a love interest, somebody that she fell for, and then, you know, see what she thinks about a lot of her feminist ideals at that point. The third act for me did start to feel a little bit aimless because of that, but, you know, that's naturally the point too, because it is, you know, a feminist odyssey. A challenging film, but one that I'm excited to see again. I'm a big Yorgos Lanthimos fan, so I found myself to be really enchanted by this film, and that's not a word that I use very often, but I'm going to use it here. Next on my list is Godzilla Minus One, and this is directed by Takeshi Yamazaki. Yeah, this is another one that was very surprising for me just because it seemed to come out of nowhere, and yet it turned out to be, yeah, one of the best films of the year, obviously, in my opinion. I love that this is a movie that recognizes what it is, and yet it really infuses a lot of emotion into it. It's a movie that it could have felt stale, and yet it feels really, really fresh. There's a lot of dramatic heft to this movie where all of the actions matter and all of the sacrifices in the movie are felt. When people die in this film, it hurts. It is very reminiscent of all of the great Steven Spielberg films of the past. It's focused in a lot of the same ways. It is emotionally personal in the same ways, but it also understands the opposite of that spectrum. It's like the intimacy they get, but they also are able to understand the spectacle of Godzilla as this giant monster. It recognizes not only the nostalgic aspects of those things, but also, you know, understanding what Godzilla can represent for the characters. Because he represents maybe a psychological barrier on a certain level, but I think on a bigger level, it represents like nuclear war and natural disaster, all these things that are, you know, echoing in our minds through history. This is what I've dreamed of. This is absolutely what I've dreamed of for so long. A real movie that is fun, where I felt it, that thrilled me. And so I think, yeah, if you're going to see a fun movie, especially on the IMAX screen, I think this should be the one. Next, I'm going with Oppenheimer, directed by Christopher Nolan. I think of all the movies this year, this is the one that I will say is maybe the most ambitious, where it actually paid off. It actually came full circle. It not only was impressive from a technical perspective, but it was also impressive from an emotional perspective. And often I find, you know, those aspects in Nolan's films to be very disjointed from one another. But here, I don't know, for the first time, it was starting to feel almost fully harmonious. I feel like he's come such a long way from stretching maybe the short-term memory loss gimmick in Memento so that it affects the editing and all of that, to actually making a movie that's like, you know, about a monumental figure. So you can still play with the editing and time and how it affects the audience and all that, while also stripping away a lot of the typical dramatic aspects that we usually see. For a film about Oppenheimer, it turned out to be very personal and vulnerable at certain points, and a lot of that is due to Cillian Murphy, who gives just an extraordinary performance. The idea of a biopic being told in the first person, where the narrator is very unreliable here, I think that is the key to the entire experience. When somebody is questioning themselves, when they're in a fragile state, where there's a lot of risk involved, a lot of that surrealism bleeds through cinematically. And I think Nolan takes advantage of all of that while also, you know, balancing a lot of the external elements. There are a million speaking parts in this movie, and it's such an overwhelming first watch. I remember thinking, God, I'm gonna have to watch this a second time to just, you know, catch my breath, it feels like. And yet it feels very symphonic so far as how it flows. I don't know exactly where I would rank this movie when I'm looking at Nolan's entire body of work, because I haven't seen everything yet. There's a couple from the past I still haven't seen, but from all the ones that I have seen, this is easily in the top 3. It felt like the type of movie that he's been slowly building to for his entire career. This was, I think, the biggest gamble of his career and perhaps the biggest payoff. So if you haven't seen this movie yet, I highly recommend it, obviously. It is truly one of the best of the year. And oh, I talked about this one earlier, but next on my list is Saltburn, directed by Emerald Fennell. And yeah, I may regret putting this on this list at some point, but right now, you know, it's what I'm feeling. I think of every film on the list, this is the one that I struggled with the most, and the one that I found to be the most polarizing, because yeah, the experience of it was just, it was difficult. I found it painfully boring. And yet I was still surprised at a lot of the places it took me, because I can't claim I've ever been taken down these avenues before in this way, where they're taking us to squalid places, to lurid places. And yet my problems with it are that it's very surfacey and very manipulative so far as the pastiche elements are concerned. Like I said before, this movie feels almost more like a scrapbook rather than like a cohesive experience. It annoyed me, and yet it compelled me. It pissed me off, and yet it had this confidence that was infectious. It had this devilish grin that I couldn't help but be intrigued by, and I love the punk rock energy of it. I wish there was more of that. And that's part of why I think the film just kept echoing in my mind. It's all of these different elements that don't work together, and yet they're so creative. This felt like a weird psychedelic frat house version of Harry Potter, where you have like Jacob Elordi as Cedric Diggory, where you have Barry Keoghan as Harry Potter here, but all through some weird kaleidoscope that is Emerald Fennell's brain. I've said that I struggle with her a lot. I struggled especially with Promising Young Woman, which she made a few years before. But there's just, like I said in my review, there's like an inflated sense of like academic delusion, I think, from a lot of directors these days. And I would put her in that category. She's very like self-conscious of the aspects of her movie, to the point where it makes it hard to find any meaning in there. And so that is part of why I get really, really frustrated. But I'm really excited to go back and watch this movie, because I'm not sure if I'm going to absolutely hate it or absolutely love it, or maybe a mix of the two. So I don't know. There's just something interesting about that to me. Next is Asteroid City, directed by Wes Anderson. And this is a film that, when I was watching it, I knew it was going to split people, because in a lot of ways, it is Anderson's most self-reflective film, his most meditative, definitely his most meta, but there's something about the way that the story is structured that I knew people would struggle with it. It's not as accessible. For me, this is definitely a pandemic film in the sense that, yeah, it was written during the pandemic, so you can obviously feel that sense of isolation in the writing. Again, that meditative experience, the quietness, the eeriness of it. I was charmed by the wackiness of it, but also, yeah, that subtle loneliness of it. The emptiness, I think, is actually part of why it worked for me. There's all these little vignettes and all of these little characters that are very deadpan in their delivery, and they slowly start to cultivate this world. And I like the idea of the story sort of layering in the way that it did. It had a very apocalyptic feeling. I think the film is all about emphasizing the now, what we have now, the interactions we have, how important they are, how unimportant they are. I think the existential angst that is coming from Wes Anderson here, just, I don't know, I like the way it was presented to me compared to maybe some of the other auteurs this year. And then last but not least, I'm going with Ferrari, and this is directed by Michael Mann. Yeah, I liked this movie. I know a lot of people struggled with it, and I'm not exactly sure why. I think compared to a lot of the other biopics we've seen this year, this one felt a lot more balanced, and a lot of the elements felt understood by the writer and director, where their functions are working on multiple levels, and yet they're always kept in focus. The film is very rhythmic, and it's really emphasizing, you know, the idea of time and machinery and technology and the tension of that risk within the racing game, but also how it affects the main character's decisions, you know, in his personal life, and there's like reverberating chaos. I admire Mann so far as how he's able to explore emotions. I find them to be very effective precisely because a lot of his characters are very pulled back, they're very terse. Especially his male characters like Ferrari in this film. You know, he's not expressing a lot of emotion and a lot of vulnerability, but that feels realistic. The effect is subtle. Plus you have Penelope Cruz in this film, who's going to cancel out a lot of that reserve stuff that we're getting from somebody like Adam Driver, because she is providing all the fire, all the intensity that one can bring. This is a fabulous performance by her. But the film I found surprising. I like how it explored maybe artistically emotions from the characters in ways that you're not used to. I like that it had some interesting editing in it, because it felt like a unique way of packaging old tropes. Again, we see biopics all the time, and I felt like at the end of the year there was just so many. It was ridiculous. But again, this one really stood out to me as a strong one. And it also never felt like it was overstaying its welcome, like a movie like Napoleon did for me, or like a movie like Maestro did for me. Maybe it's not for everybody, but I was just really engaged by it, especially from a tension perspective. I thought all of that built really beautifully. So yeah, I consider it a strong film. But yes, that is my list for 2023. Again, who knows what it could be tomorrow, but this is what it is today. And obviously I want to know from you guys what some of your favorite movies were of the year. What movies do I need to check out? But that is the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I'm an artist. I do commissioned portraits and I sell prints of my work. If that's something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a print, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my patrons who are great. Guys, thank you so much for your support. Welcome to all the new members. If you're interested in supporting, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.